Hi everyone, my name is Navtane and this is Atman. We are two cricket lovers who grew up watching Test cricket in the 90s and the 2000s and have been following India from anywhere in the world. We wake up at 4 a.m. or 3 a.m. to watch uh, India play Australia, Bangladesh, England. Uh, Last week, I was up till 4 a.m. watching Shan Masood and Abdullah Shafiq hit a century in a match they eventually lost. And we're here to talk about Test cricket and a few ideas we have around it. We want to share going forward in some of the episodes some of our greatest memories of Test cricket, what we love about it, why it's different from the rest of the game, why it's completely different from any other game in the world, and just have fun doing that.
Yeah. So everyone, my name is Atman. Naftin and I have known each other for over 25 years
Yep.
now. We only discovered our respective passions for cricket maybe around 10 years ago. But yes, like he said, like it's not just the India games. I've gotten texts at 3 a.m. from Naftin asking me to turn on the TV and watch a match in the last year or so, and always feel like there's something exciting going on. And every time we're kind of bemoaning there not being enough test cricket or too much test cricket, and I think every time we worry about the health of the game, like something amazing happens, and we've seen this happen over the last few years. We have a few ideas that we think might be interesting to explore as we think about how we can make this game that we love even better, and so that more people can enjoy it. And hopefully we're going to do that a little bit today.
Awesome. Thanks, Atman. So, in that spirit, Atman has an idea he's been working on for a few years, and he's even written a talk about it. We won't share the whole talk, but I'll let Atman go ahead and give us a 3 minute explainer about the idea.
Sure. So I think one of the things that the test cricket struggles with in general is that it's an expensive sport. It relies a lot on TV revenues, and we have a structure in which the power, or like the relative difference in resources available, is pretty disparate across the big three countries: India, England, Australia, and everyone else as a distant third. I think the interesting one of the interesting outcomes of that is that you have, amongst the bigger parties, like a lot more resources put into the first class structure, um, a lot more money available for players and salaries and lucrative contracts, and which means that they have a large pool of players. However, the interesting thing about sport is like there can only be 11 players playing at any given time. A squad is 15 to 17 or maybe 20 if you account for fringe players, and there's a lot of players who would otherwise, I think, who are still test quality, who do not get to participate and play test cricket today. And I think as fans, that's a disservice as well. So I think the idea here is that we're going to explore the concept of player free agency, and we're going to try to do some thought experiments around why we think that that's an exciting potential prospect.
Awesome. So, what does player free agency mean? In today's world, before I get you to answer this, in today's world, we have 10 cricket playing nations. We have the top three who are definitely miles ahead. We have countries such as New Zealand, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, West Indies, who at certain times have been world beaters, have been world champions. New Zealand recently won the World Test Championship and are struggling right now. Sri Lanka just swept them 2-0, which was a surprise to a lot of people. And then we have countries who are struggling to come up, such as Afghanistan, whom we all love in the white ball format, but they haven't really had the opportunity to prove their worth in the test cricket. It was a pity that the previous game in Greater Noida got drained out, and we have teams such as West Indies who at one point had a huge talented pool of players, but are struggling to find that talent right now. So in this world, what does free agency mean?
Yeah. So I think all of those are valid points, right? And I think that the exciting thing about cricket is that even given how like how misstructured it is, and the disparity in resources available, we still see that there's a lot of passion to play the sport, and there's also enough room for upsets. We saw Bangladesh and Pakistan, we saw West Indies and Australia last year, we saw Sri Lanka push England pretty hard and actually pull a win off in England, which very few people were expecting. So there, the challenge lies in the fact that there's two things. One is obviously the distribution of resources, which we'll talk about maybe in another episode. But the more pertinent thing is that even if resources were equally distributed, it would take time and investment and structure for them to develop a pool of players and pay them enough to build squads that are competitive in all conditions, right? What free agency means is that we have large pools. In the simplest way to say it is that a player should not be restricted to where they can play based on their country of birth, right? So today there are kind of nationalist restrictions of like country of origin, registration, etc., that define player eligibility. I think like the notable examples of exceptions to this rule have largely been from South African countries, including South Africa and Zimbabwe, kind of, and even the West Indies or former Commonwealth countries going back to the UK under the Kolpak rule. But even with that window closed, like there's few examples or very few examples of players playing for countries or representing countries where they weren't born.
Yeah.
Um, the weird sort of exception that exists is the West Indies, which is like a confederation, right, of many different countries. However, the point being that the idea here is as simple as that you should be allowed to play for anyone.
Yeah, and for the purpose of West Indies, let's treat them as one country, not
Yeah.
because they are, but because that's been the cricketing cultures for as long as cricket has existed. So
And it is one board.
yeah, it is, and it is one board, right? But to your point, imagine a world where we never got to saw Peterson bat or
Yeah.
Strauss captain.
Yes, I think that's exactly what we're talking about. And like the other reality of the situation is that I think India is the most notable example, but Australia is another, and England in other cases where there are players who are clearly good enough to play Test cricket, have played Test cricket many times before, but are not, for good reasons, like potential like members of the current squads for their
Yeah.
national teams, but they have the experience and skills that we would love to see them continue to play.
Yeah.
And other countries with particular gaps in those areas could benefit greatly, not only from just the pure skill of having a player there, but also from a mentorship and experience building standpoint.
Yeah, and to give you an example, let's take this one specific example that prompted this discussion, which is we both love Pujara because he went to Australia and he took those hard blows and made that 2021 series win possible. He's done that multiple times for India, but India is moving on from Pujara, and we see reasons why, right? And we understand those reasons. You have to groom the next 10, 15 years of batting, and we have a huge pool of talented players who can replace him. But imagine Sri Lanka with the uh, recent form and introduction of Kaimendu Mendes and Kosel Mendes doing well and Chandimal doing well. Uh, if they can get a number three player like Pujara, who can hold the innings together and let all of these free flowing batsmen just express themselves. There's no reason why they can't be a 350 plus first innings team every time they play a test match.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And I think that, another notable example that you can think of is Rahane, very similar vintage, very different player, obviously, but someone who's, consistently demonstrated in challenging conditions that he can help rebuild innings and build innings around him.
Yeah.
And you take the example of the West Indies, who have a lot of promising young fast bowlers, a couple of very exciting young batsmen, one seasoned opener who's probably coming towards the end of
Yeah.
his career, but the addition of an experienced middle order batter with like a few years left in the tank could potentially have an outsized impact, not just to your point, not just with their own runs, but also the ability for the rest of the team to score around them.
Exactly.
Right.
And I promise you, this discussion is not going to be about Indian players who maybe past their prime, are at 35, 36 years of age. We also want to discuss some young players who are waiting while the stalwarts of the game, such as Rohit and Virat Kohli, uh, retire to make their mark on the world stage, can at that till that time ply their trade elsewhere and come back to India when that slot is open as a proven professional who've played through multiple international teams and are just ready to go.
Yeah.
There's no grooming at that point, right? And
or are willing to stay wherever they're playing
Yeah.
and continue their careers there.
yeah,
right?
whichever works for them best, right? That's free agency for players.
Yes.
It's not you come back after you have had 3 stints in county cricket like Zahir Khan did, and he became a much better bowler. But imagine Zahir said after that, "Oh, I can just play for England and do much better. I can average under 20 because the ball swings exactly the way I want it." Right?
Yep.
Probably not a good thing for Indian cricket, but for Zahir, probably would have been the best thing in his career. So before we get into a few of these player examples that we have planned for, let me ask you a question, Atman, which is, this sounds awfully a lot like an international franchisee model, right? If you think of the IPL, it's very similar where you have 7 players from India and then 4 international players who come in, plug those gaps, make the stream stronger. You get to build a pool of 20, 25, 30 players who can play an entire 14 to 16 game season, including finals and stuff. How is this different? Why is this different, and why does it need to be different?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And, you and I, this is not the first time we've had this discussion. And I think, that's the idealized end state in my mind of like true free agency. And I think that there's value in retaining the national identities of these teams in particular, which is somewhat distinct from building a franchise tournament from scratch, in particular because there's so much important legacy and history attached to some of these sort of bilateral rivalries in particular. The Ashes being the obvious example, Border Gavaskar, Basil Oliveira Trophy, all of these are like really, really notable examples. And then the really interesting thing for me is that we are, this might be a step towards that eventual direction, but I do think, unraveling the overall structure in its entirety might be too disruptive for the game. And also, you have a lot of incumbent powers that have vested interests and may not be as open to a full overhaul. Alternatively, it could be that maybe that's an easier way to do it rather than changing the existing structure, but that's the intention.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. And since we both have day jobs and are product managers in our day jobs, I'm going to ask you a very product manager question. In the short term, you're thinking of, say, Pujara playing for Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka retaining the name of the team and it still being an international tournament. Is that how you see it? And in the longer term, do you see more than 10 teams playing test cricket, or we want to call it something else, but it's essentially test cricket? Maybe a 20 team structure or a 25 team structure? Because according to me, one of the biggest things that test cricket does not do well is its exclusive nature, where you only have 10 teams. Right? There are only so many Australia-England matches that you can see after which you'll say, how many more will I watch? Right? Imagine India playing Argentina or Australia playing Netherlands in test cricket. Wouldn't that be exciting?
I would love that, right? And I think that the really big hurdle towards that is having enough quality players and paying them enough, right?
Exactly.
And I think the other interesting thing that this does is it also removes the sort of minimal barrier for a player. And like, we can take a somewhat controversial example, but Sandeep Lamachani being an example of a very talented player from a country that would probably struggle to put up a test team, like almost certainly struggle. Or you look at, Rashid Khan in the early days of Afghanistan, like there are probably 3 or 4 players from a lot of these countries who themselves are definitely good enough to play test cricket, but
which team would not just take Rashid Khan if he comes in.
Yeah. I mean,
Right?
it's a
There
no-brainer.
is no team in this world who will not benefit from a Rashid
Yeah, I
Khan.
mean, he would put. I would argue that he would give Ashwin and Jadeja a little bit of a scare in terms of
Yeah, and
their who's
remember,
going to be
he's
the
only 23.
Yeah.
He's still he's yet to hit his prime as a batter or a bowler.
Yeah. So
Right.
I think that's the point of like, yes, the intention is towards expansion. In order for it to expand, you need it to be lucrative enough for players to do it. But I always, like, whenever I have these arguments with friends and other people before, is I always give the example of golf, right?
Yeah.
Like the fact that you have hundreds of golf players from all over the world, and for a sport that requires much more time,
Yeah.
much more energy, much more patient viewing, and is largely TV driven. I
Yeah.
think there are a lot of parallels that we could pick up from golf, or you look at the other end of the spectrum in Formula One of
Yeah.
just because a sport is unusual in the time that it takes and the effort that it takes to create a spectacle does not mean that it's limited in terms of scope. It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be.
And to be honest, of all the sports in the world, I think golf is a very good example of a test cricket parallel, because basketball is played in a controlled environment. The deck is always the deck. The air conditioning is always the air conditioning. The ring size and the court size is always the court size. Football, the court size, soccer or football, the court size might vary a little, but that does not have that big of an impact or on the game.
Mhm.
But cricket is literally different from whether it's played in Multan or Lords or Perth or Rajkot, where it can spin so much that it's impossible to score 5 runs, or the ball can do almost nothing where you score 300, or it swings so much that a bowler such as Praveen Kumar comes and takes 7 wickets, and we say, yeah, that's par for the course.
Yeah.
Right. So I do understand that parallel. I do want to spend a couple of minutes going through the list of players that we had come up with before we started recording this, and uh, not surprisingly, there are a lot of Indian players in the list, but I want to pivot a little, because we have spoken about a couple of Indian players. I want to pivot a little to some of the Australian names that we had on our list of players who probably aren't going to be regulars for Australia, or have played for Australia, or are in the verges of playing for, or in the brink of playing for Australia, but not there yet, and how other teams could benefit from it, right? So I have this list over here. I'm going to read it out, and then you can pick up a couple of names and explain how some other team would benefit from it, right? So we have Cameron Bancroft, we have Scott Boland, Marcus Harris, Glenn Maxwell, Matthew Kuhneman, Tanveer Sangha, Dougie Bollinger.
Yeah, and Steketee is another one I
Yeah.
would add there. So I think like going through this exercise, and actually like while we were having this conversation, I think you can group the types of players that we're looking at into three broad buckets, right? Like one are players who are slightly past their prime and therefore not in consideration for the longer term plans for their test teams, right? There are players who are young and of too much of a similar type to existing depth in the squad. So if you look at like medium fast bowling all rounders in Australia, like I don't think anybody's getting in ahead of Green and Marsh right
Yep.
now, right? And which is a rare thing. I don't think any other country has that. England has one, and he can
Yeah.
barely walk. But
Yeah.
like
We have one who's too afraid to play test cricket.
Yep. and so that there's notable examples, and then there's young players who have not yet kind of can't break into the teams, and there are other players who like just by virtue of like the bizarre example of like Glenn Maxwell, of somebody who's so talented, as a skill set that Australia don't have in a lot of ways, really wants to play test cricket, but just for some reason has not, right?
Yeah.
And
Doesn't have a place in the team.
doesn't have a place in the team. And so I think these are like the sort of broad buckets that I would look at. So young emerging players who can't break into the squad, or are a few years away from being able to get in.
Yeah.
Players past their prime, and this third X factor category of like players who want to play but for some reason can't find a place in the team and are kind of still at or in the middle of their prime productive years.
Awesome. So I'm going to pick just one player, and I'm going to let you explain how that player can do well in any team that you choose. And it's not going to be an easy one.
Okay.
Matthew Kunnerman.
Okay.
Sorry.
Matthew Kunnerman,
Yeah.
left arm spinner, young, good fielder, decent batsman. Lower, I think he's like decent.
Can hold the bat.
Can hold the bat. That's
Yeah.
not
Maybe
terrible.
be a night watchman.
Yeah. So if you look around the world of like players like or teams that don't need him for sure, or Bangladesh, because they
Yeah.
have an army of left arm spinners.
Medias and Miras.
Right.
Yeah.
Then you have, Sri Lanka typically produce a lot of left arm spinners and probably don't need him. South Africa are in the rare position where they actually have a very good left arm spinner who's a very attacking left arm spinner, not just like the Paul Harris mold of boring defensive bowler. But West Indies is a notable example, right? Like I think West Indies have lacked a sort of hold the end. I know Gudakesh Moti is there, but he's a little bit more of a mystery spinner more. I don't know if he's got the ability to hold up an end as much.
Ball the same ball over and over and over again. Wear the batsman down, make them play that bad shot, get that wicket.
Yeah, and also
dry up the runs, let the fast bowlers rest.
I think that's the last one is the most interesting one for me. Of like, if you have an all conditions spinner who can hold up an end, even in areas where they're not taking a lot of wickets, it gives the fast bowlers a lot more breathing room, and particularly the young and upcoming ones who aren't possibly like fully physically developed into their prime yet.
Yeah,
it gives them the buffer that they need to kind of do that. So I think like it's a plausible example. I can't think of Kunnerman, playing for Australia anytime soon. I can't think of many other teams, but like I think he could definitely add value to a team like the West Indies.
Yep.
And you could argue maybe even to New Zealand, right?
Yeah, or England.
Or even England, right?
Yeah, they're sticking with Shoaib Bashir for now, and he's going to be a good bowler maybe in a few years down the line.
Yeah,
but right
England
now they don't have anyone apart from Jack Leach who can do that.
And Leach is injury prone and illness prone, so
and
it's
he's
a good backup.
Little older.
Yeah. So like it's a perfect example of like a squad player for England, potentially a sometime starter for a team like New Zealand, and potentially 50% of the games that West Indies play, particularly on West Indian pitches the way they are today, he might be a very valuable player.
Awesome, great. So this is a small flavor of what we've been doing and thinking in our free time. Stick with us. We're going to be talking a lot more about other aspects of Test cricket, and maybe sometimes get into some of the other world championships, such as Champions Trophy or World Cricket, or World Cups. But Test cricket is going to be our focus. We're going to share about our favorite memories of going to the ground and standing in line for 3 hours to watch Sachin play, of wearing the same flag over every time I go to a cricket stadium and Kohli scores a century, or even trying to, or even just what Lakshman's innings in 2001 meant and felt like, right? So we're going to be talking about a host of other things. Stick with us and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you.